At the Christmas dinner, my billionaire son raised his glass and bragged Dad must be enjoying that $20,000 allowance each month. The room erupted in applause. Guests clapped for him, calling him a generous son, a man of honor. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my proud smile, but my chest burned with fury because the truth was far from their cheers. There was no allowance, no generosity. At 67, I was working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. Nights scrubbing floors in an office, mornings stocking shelves at a grocery, weekends driving deliveries in the freezing cold. My hands ached, my back screamed, and yet in front of that glittering room, my son paraded me as his trophy of kindness. That wasn't love, it was betrayal. And in that moment, as the applause roared and my daughter-in-law's smug smile tightened across her face, I made a vow. I would not let his lie become my legacy. I would expose him right there and force the truth into the open. When I spoke, the room fell silent, forks froze in midair, and my son's perfect world began to crack. But that Christmas night was only the beginning. Because once betrayal is dragged into the light, revenge demands to be served. And tell me, what would you do if your own blood stole your dignity to polish his My name is Richard Collins. I am 67 years old. A man who once spent decades as a mid-level accountant balancing books for companies that no longer exist. I should be in quiet retirement, enjoying the kind of peace men my age dream about. Instead, I carry the weight of strained muscles and unpaid bills, watching from the margins as my own son basks in the glow of his success. That night, I was seated at his long mahogany table in a dining hall large enough to swallow my apartment whole. The chandeliers shimmered above us, reflecting off crystal glasses and polished silverware. It was Christmas Eve, and the house buzzed with guests dressed in velvet gowns and tailored suits, all eager to toast the host of the evening, my son Michael. Michael had built an empire in real estate, his name printed on billboards across Dallas. He was 38, handsome in the way wealth can polish any man with a tailored tuxedo, and the confident smirk of someone who never heard the word no. He thrived on spectacle, on making every gathering not just a dinner but a stage. That night was no exception. The waiters moved like a choreographed dance, trays of champagne glasses catching the light. From where I sat, I felt the eyes of strangers slide past me. Some nodded politely, some offered half smiles, but most seemed to be waiting for Michael to perform. And perform he did. When the music softened and the clinking of forks slowed, Michael stood, glass raised high, commanding the room without saying a word. A hush fell. He looked around, his gaze landing on me as though I were a prop he had carefully placed on stage. Then, with the ease of a man rehearsed, he declared Dad must be enjoying that $20,000 allowance each month. Laughter rippled, then applause roared. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering words like, "What a generous son, and he takes such good care of his father." They believed him. They wanted to believe him. In a world obsessed with image, nothing charmed more than the sight of wealth parading as virtue. Sophia, my daughter-in-law, sat to his right, elegant, poised, with the kind of diamond necklace that catches every light in the room. She leaned toward the woman beside her and added sweetly, "Richard's never been happier since Michael took charge." Her words floated like perfume, cloying and false. People turned their heads, nodding, smiling. A woman across the table pressed her hand to her chest as though touched by such devotion. And then all eyes shifted to me. In that moment, I felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes pressing down on me, demanding my performance. They wanted a proud father, a grateful smile, perhaps even a nod of affirmation. Instead, my throat closed, my hands trembled. The fork slipped from my grip, clattering against the china plate. The sound was sharp, out of place, like truth breaking into a room built on lies. I bent to retrieve it, and when I straightened, I forced a smile that tasted like ashes. My chest burned with a fury I could not show. My son's lie echoed in my ears louder than the applause. They were cheering for an illusion, and I was trapped inside it. I wanted to shout then, to tell them the truth, that there was no allowance, no monthly check, no generosity. That at my age I was scrubbing office floors at midnight, stocking shelves before dawn, delivering packages on weekends just to afford rent. But the words lodged in my throat. My pride, the same pride they used against me, chained me to silence. The applause washed over me, each clap a reminder of how far I had fallen, not from wealth, but from dignity. I sat there nodding faintly, letting them think what they wanted to think, while inside me, something dark took root. As the laughter resumed and the music swelled again, I glanced around the table. The faces blurred into a sea of strangers who believed they had witnessed a heartwarming scene of a son honoring his father. Michael leaned toward Sophia, whispering something that made her smile. She reached for his hand under the table. They were united in their performance partners in a show staged at my expense. I gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, forcing myself to sit still. Yet I knew this moment would not pass easily. It would not dissolve into memory. It had carved itself deep into me, searing like a brand. That night, as my fork clattered to the floor and the applause rose around me, I understood something vital. Silence had protected Michael's lie, but silence was killing me. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what might happen if I broke it. My son's smirk lingered, his words echoing, and I swallowed hard, staring at the untouched plate before me. The meat had gone cold, but my anger burned hotter with every passing second. And as I forced myself through the rest of that dinner, one thought followed me like a shadow. They had given him their applause, but someday soon I would take it away. When I finally stepped back into my apartment, the silence hit me harder than the winter air outside. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort but reminds you how empty a place can feel when there is no one waiting. No warmth, no life. My coat still smelled faintly of the perfume and wine from Michael's dinner party, and for a moment it made me nauseous. I hung it on the crooked hook by the door and stood in the dark, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. It was the only sound in the apartment, and it felt mocking, as if reminding me what little I had left. I opened the refrigerator door, and the pale yellow light flickered weakly over its barren shelves. A half-empty carton of milk sat at the back, expiration date long past, its sour smell escaping when I tilted it forward. Next to it was a single packet of instant noodles, the cheap kind you buy in bulk when you're counting pennies. I leaned against the door, staring at the emptiness. The applause from earlier that night still rang in my ears. Layered with Sophia's honeyed words, "Richard's never been happier." My throat tightened. Happier? If this was happiness, what did misery look like? I shut the door and shuffled into the living room. The heater was cold, silent. A red slip from the utility company lay crumpled on the table, stamped with the words "Final Notice." I couldn't pay it, not after the rent and the pills for my blood pressure. So I had turned it off, letting the apartment become just another cold shell in the middle of winter. I pulled my old wool coat tighter around me, its elbows worn thin, the stitching unraveling. My breath hung in the air, visible clouds in my own home. The cold didn't just bite at my skin, it sank into my bones, the kind of ache that makes you feel every year of your age. I sat in the sagging armchair that had followed me from house to house since the divorce. My knees ached as I lowered myself, and I pressed my hands together, watching them tremble. The hands of a man who once signed paychecks, balanced books, built a modest life. Now those same hands clutched at a threadbare coat, clinging to warmth that wasn't there. I thought of Michael's tuxedo sleeve brushing against his Rolex as he raised his glass, and a bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. The bitterness gave way to something heavier. My eyes burned as tears welled up, and I let them fall because there was no one here to see. They slid down the lines of my face, warm against skin that felt colder by the second. I buried my face in my hands, but the memory of that dinner room came rushing back. The clinking glasses, the admiring glances, the thunder of applause. They weren't clapping for me. They were clapping for the lie that my own son had crafted, a lie that painted me as a man well cared for, a man with nothing to want. I lifted my head, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. My voice cracked as I whispered to the empty room. They applauded his lie while I can't even keep the lights on. The words echoed off the peeling wallpaper, hollow and sharp. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was a wound that cut deeper each time I replayed it. For the first time, I felt anger grow larger than my shame. I stood and walked back to the refrigerator, opening it again as though hoping something had appeared since I last checked. The same carton of sour milk stared back. I slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the tiny apartment. My chest rose and fell quickly, anger spilling over in ways I hadn't let myself feel in years. I realized that my silence, my willingness to endure, had given Michael the power to create his fantasy. He had counted on my pride to keep me quiet, and he had been right. Until now. The cold gnawed at me, but beneath it I felt something else stirring, something that warmed me more than any furnace ever could. The beginnings of defiance. I walked to the window, staring out at the city lights glittering in the distance. Somewhere among those towers, Michael and Sophia were basking in their wealth, congratulating themselves on the perfect performance they had staged. They didn't know that in this freezing apartment their father had stopped swallowing his pre. They didn't know that tonight the seed of revenge had been planted. I drew the curtains shut and returned to the chair, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to think clearly. Tomorrow the grind would begin again. The early shift at the grocery, the delivery routes, the office floors waiting to be scrubbed. My body would ache and my back would scream, but tonight in the quiet dark I let my fury sharpen into resolve. Because humiliation has a way of turning into fuel, and I knew I was already burning. As I finally closed my eyes, the cold pressing in from every corner, I pictured the look on Sophia's face when she whispered her lie, the smug pride in Michael's smile. I pictured the guests applauding, blind to the truth. And I promised myself this one day I would make them see. One day I would drag the truth into the light so blinding it would scorch them. The thought carried me into uneasy sleep, my breath still fogging the air like smoke from a fire that had only just begun to burn. The night after sitting alone in my frozen apartment, I dragged myself into the convenience store where the air smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly glow. I tied on the apron that had lost its shape years ago and faced the mountain of boxes waiting in the back room. My body was already aching from the day's other jobs, but the work didn't care. The shelves had to be filled, the aisles had to look neat. I bent, lifted, carried, stacked again and again until my muscles screamed. Hours passed with no relief. My knees wobbled each time I crouched to pull cans from a box. Sweat chilled against my skin, even in the cold air that slipped through the automatic doors. As I straightened up, my vision swam. I leaned against the metal shelf chest, heaving. It felt like the room was shrinking around me, pressing me down. Still, I forced myself back to the work, reaching for another case, telling myself I could last until morning. While I was kneeling to gather a scattered row of packages, I heard footsteps and then an impatient voice. A young man no older than my grandson would have been leaned around the aisle and snapped, "Old man, hurry up." The words cut sharper than any box cutter. He didn't see me as someone who had worked his whole life, only as an obstacle in his way. My hands shook harder as I reached for the last package. I looked down and saw my shoes. The leather was worn bald seams, splitting laces frayed to strings. The floor's cold seeped straight through the thin soles, chilling my feet, as if to remind me of every step that had brought me here. My hands, rough and trembling, fumbled the package back onto the shelf. For a moment I wondered if the customers could see what my son had hidden, not a man living on generosity, but a man ground down to dust. The weight of the next box was too much. I lifted, staggered, and the world tilted. My back gave a jolt of pain so sharp it stole my breath. The fluorescent lights blurred into streaks above me, then disappeared as I collapsed against the shelving. Cans rattled a metallic rain before everything went dark. When I came to, I was slumped in the break room chair with Ray, the night manager, pressing a bottle of water into my hand. My chest felt hollow, my arms heavy as stone. He looked at me with worry and said, "You need to slow down, Mr. Collins. You're killing yourself." My voice cracked as I forced the words out. 3 jobs at 67. This is what betrayal feels like. It was the truth I couldn't say at the dinner table, bleeding out in a room that smelled of reheated noodles and stale coffee. I sat there in Sunt, sipping water that did little to wash away the bitterness. My body ached, but beneath the pain something else stirred. The humiliation was no longer quiet. It was becoming fire, burning hotter each day. I knew then that if I didn't fight back, I wouldn't just collapse in a store aisle, I'd vanish completely, leaving Michael's lie to live on without me. As the clock ticked toward dawn, my phone buzzed with a message. I didn't want to look, but I did. Michael's voice spilled through the speaker, warm and practiced. "Hey, Dad. Hope you're doing well. Don't worry about anything. I've got you covered." The same voice that charmed strangers, the same lie he wrapped around me like a shroud. I gripped the phone until my knuckles whitened. The shift was over, but I felt the battle had just begun. And for the first time, I wondered how far I would be willing to go to rip the mask from my son's face. The hours after my collapse at the store clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. My back still throbbed, my knees burned, and every movement reminded me that I had pushed my body too far. But worse than the pain was the voicemail I'd replayed 3 times on the ride home. Michael's polished voice, smooth as glass, telling me he had me covered. The same lie he had told the world. The words settled like poison in my chest until I could no longer sit quietly in my freezing apartment. That night I decided I would confront him directly. I sat at the small kitchen table with the phone in my hand, the glow from its screen throwing pale light across the unpaid bills spread before me. My thumb hovered over his number. For years I had convinced myself that silence protected me, that confronting him would only make me look bitter, maybe even delusional. But now silence was no longer protection. It was complicity. I pressed the call button and listened to the dial tone beat steady against my ear. Dad Michael's voice answered casual, as though he were surprised but not concerned. In the background I could hear faint laughter and the clink of glasses. He was hosting charming living in his other world, while mine grew smaller every day. I didn't waste time. "Where is that money you say you give me?" My voice cracked like ice breaking on a winter lake. It was not a question softened by doubt, but a demand carved by years of exhaustion. For a moment he said nothing. Then came a laugh, practiced and thin. "Maybe you just forgot, Dad." He said it lightly, as though he were humoring a child who misplaced his keys. I gripped tightly on the phone. Forgot I didn't forget the red roses taped on the bill. I don't forget choosing between rent and medicine. Don't treat me like I've lost my mind. There was a shuffle on the other end, a muted whisper, and then Sophia's voice slid into the line, smooth and sharp. "Stop embarrassing yourself." Her words dripped with irritation, as though my very existence was a stain on their carefully polished life. The humiliation boiled over hotter than the cold in my bones. Embarrassing myself, you stood by while your husband lied in front of 50 people clapping for money that never touched my hands. You both humiliated me, not the other way around. My voice rose despite the tightness in my throat. Michael sighed, his tone now dipped in condescension. Dad, you're tired. You get confused. I said what I said because I wanted to honor you. Why ruin that? People see you as cared for, respected. Isn't that what matters? Something inside me snapped. Respect built on lies isn't respect. It's a mask. And I may be old, but I'm not senile. My words hit the air with the weight of stone, impossible to pull back. Silence stretched on the other end. I imagined Michael's jaw tightening, Sophia giving him that sideways glance that always meant she was calculating damage. Then, without warning, the line went dead. He had cut me off just as easily as he had erased me with a smile at his Christmas table. I stared at the phone in my hand, listening to the emptiness in my ear. The fury that had been simmering now surged into something sharper. If he thought ending a call would end the truth, he didn't know me as well as he believed. I set the phone down among the bills and leaned back in my chair. My body was tired, but my mind was awake in a way it hadn't been in years. The lie had lasted long enough. Through the thin walls of my apartment, the neighbor's television flickered faintly with late-night news, a story about corruption, about someone finally being held accountable. I closed my eyes and saw Michael at the dinner table again. Sophia's diamonds flashing in the light, the room applauding. This time I didn't just see humiliation. I saw evidence, witnesses, 50 pairs of eyes who had heard him claim what never was. I opened the drawer beside me and pulled out the old folder where I kept my records. The thin stack of bank statements, the letters from Social Security, the receipts that painted a picture of struggle rather than ease. Alone they had felt like proof of my failure, but against Michael's claims they were proof of something else entirely. I laid them out on the table, smoothing the wrinkles with my palm. You want to play with image, I whispered into the empty room. Let's see how your image survives the truth. The air was so cold my breath fogged above the paper, but I didn't feel the chill anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't ashamed of my poverty. I was angry enough to weaponize it. I didn't yet know where this road would lead, but I knew one thing with certainty: I was done being silent. I would dig until I found every crack in the story my son and his wife had built. And when I did, I would make sure the whole city saw it. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving the papers spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. My phone buzzed once more in the dark. It wasn't Michael calling back. It was a number I hadn't dialed in years, glowing on the screen like a reminder. Patrick Hayes, attorney at law. And in that moment I knew exactly who I would call when morning came. The next morning I rose earlier than usual, not because I was rested, but because my mind would not allow me to lie in bed any longer. The apartment was still cold, the frost clinging to the window panes like a reminder of my reality. On the table, my bank statements lay where I had left them, along with the card bearing Patrick Hayes' name. I hadn't spoken to Patrick in years, but his steady voice returned to me as clearly as if we'd talked yesterday. He was a man who believed in paper trails and consequences, the kind of lawyer who could make numbers speak louder than money. I dialed the number, and when his secretary gave me a slot, I knew fate had cracked open a door. The cafe sat on the corner of Elm and Harwood, the same one Patrick and I had visited when we were younger men mapping out modest futures. Its windows were fogged with steam, and the smell of roasted beans met me even before I pushed the door open. I spotted him instantly, older now, his hair thinned and silvered, but his posture still upright, his eyes still sharp. He stood to shake my hand, his grip firm, his gaze searching as though he could already see the weight I carried. We sat in a booth at the back where the hum of conversation dimmed. I told him everything, my words spilling out faster than I intended, the Christmas dinner lie. The applause that mocked me, the empty refrigerator, the endless shifts, and finally the call that ended with silence. I slid my bank statements across the table. "This is all I have," I said. No deposits, no allowance, nothing but his words and my humiliation. Patrick studied the papers, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "Richard," he said finally, his voice steady, "this isn't just a family disagreement. This is elder financial abuse. It's not just immoral, it's unlawful." The words hit me harder than I expected. Abuse. I had thought of betrayal, of shame, but to hear it named as a crime turned my humiliation into evidence, my silence into complicity. I leaned back, struggling to steady my breathing. Patrick reached for his coffee, then set it down untouched. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "when Michael was a boy, maybe 12? And I told you he had a silver tongue. I said he could charm the skin off a snake. I meant it as praise back then." His eyes lifted to mine, regret etched deep. "Now I see it differently. Charm without conscience is just another weapon." The cafe's clatter faded from my awareness. All I could hear was my pulse and Patrick's words wrapping around the truth I had always feared but never named. My son hadn't just lied for appearances. He had built a structure on my silence, a lie so carefully polished it gleamed in front of strangers. Patrick tapped the bank statements with his finger. "If they stole your name, we'll make them choke on it." The resolve in his tone steadied something inside me. For the first time in years, I felt less alone, as though the burden had shifted ever so slightly onto another pair of shoulders. Patrick pulled a notepad from his briefcase, his pen scratching across the page with urgency. "First, we'll need to trace the so-called trust," he mentioned. "If it exists, it will be registered. If it doesn't, then we know he's using a ghost to hide funds. Either way, there's a trail." I nodded, my hands clenched on the table. He told me I must be confused, that I should stop embarrassing myself. But the only embarrassment here is his. The anger tasted different now, sharper, cleaner. It wasn't the hot fury of humiliation, it was the cold edge of purpose. Patrick leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I want you to be prepared. This won't just be about paperwork. If Michael and Sophia are willing to lie in front of a room full of witnesses, they'll be willing to fight dirty when cornered. You need to know this will get uglier before it gets better." "I've lived ugly," I replied. "What I can't live with anymore is silence." The waitress refilled our coffee cups, but neither of us drank. Patrick slid the notepad across to me, then a list of documents and dates he would need. Names of witnesses from the Christmas dinner, anything that could tether Michael's lie to the truth. I tucked it into my coat pocket like a secret weapon. When we rose to leave, Patrick placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Richard. They may have built a house of lies, but we'll find the cracks." His words carried the weight of promise. I stepped back into the cold morning air, the city already alive with commuters and horns, but everything looked different. The humiliation still sat heavy in my chest, but now it had direction. I wasn't drifting anymore. I had a course. As I walked toward the bus stop, I felt the notepad press against my side, the outline of the truth I intended to carve into daylight. And then as I reached into my pocket for change, I pulled out something else, a folded slip of paper I didn't recognize wedged between the bill. On it in hurried handwriting were the words, "Ask Maria. She knows." The slip of paper with Maria's name burned in my pocket like a secret too heavy to ignore. Patrick's words still echoed in my ears as I stood outside Michael's glass office tower the next afternoon, staring up at the steel and windows that gleamed like untouchable armor. My son's empire stretched high into the Dallas sky, and inside every surface gleamed with polish. But even fortresses have cracks, and Maria Lopez was one of them. Maria had worked for Michael and Sophia for nearly a decade, a maid who knew the house better than either of them. She met me in the service hallway, her uniform plain, her eyes darting like a woman who knew how easily walls had ears. "Senor Collins," she whispered, pulling me into the small supply room where cleaning carts were lined up like soldiers. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, glancing at the door before turning the screen toward me. The photo showed a check, bold letters across the top, $20,000. The signature line bore Michael's flourish, but the payee stopped me cold. Not Richard Collins. Not my name at all. It was written out to S. Torres. My lips parted, but no sound came. Maria lowered her voice. "That's Sophia's maiden name." I saw her smile when she deposited it. She said. Maria hesitated, her hands tightening around the phone. She said, "It's easy to keep Richard quiet. He's too proud to beg." The words hit harder than Michael's lie at Christmas. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. Too proud to beg. That was how they kept me invisible. They hadn't just stolen my dignity, they had mocked it, turned my silence into their shield. My hands shook as I reached for the phone, staring at the image, willing it to vanish. But the truth was etched in ink. Maria's eyes filled with pity. "Your name was never on those checks." I sank back against the wall, my knees unsteady. The photo glared up at me, every number another nail driven into the coffin of trust. Sophia wasn't just complicit. She was orchestrating, hiding behind her old name like a mask, funneling the very money they claimed to give me into her own hands. The bitterness in my mouth was so sharp it felt like blood. For years I had thought Michael's betrayal was enough to crush me. But Sophia's words revealed something worse. Together they had built a system to erase me, a stage play where I was the grateful father while behind the curtain they robbed me blind. I imagined her face at the dinner table, diamonds flashing as she leaned toward her friend, voice dripping with false sweetness. Richard's never been happier. Now I understood the contempt that lay beneath her smile. Maria touched my arm lightly, her voice urgent. "I shouldn't even have shown you this. If they find out..." She trailed off, fear flashing in her eyes. I steadied myself, forcing my voice into steel. "They already made a show of me. Now it's my turn." The supply room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Outside, the muffled sounds of the office continued, phones ringing, heels clicking, Michael's world spinning untouched. But in my hands I held the proof that could crack it open. As I slipped the folded printout of the photo into my coat pocket, I felt the tremor in my fingers turn into something steadier. Fury had become direction. I looked at Maria, whose face was pale but resolute. "You've done more for me today than my own family." Her eyes darted once more toward the door, and she whispered, "Be careful, Senor Collins. They won't forgive you for knowing." I stepped back into the polished hallway, my reflection staring back from every gleaming surface. For the first time, I didn't see an old man beaten down by lies. I saw a man holding the first stone aimed at the glass castle my son and his wife had built. As the elevator doors closed around me, my phone buzzed. It wasn't Patrick this time. It was a blocked number with a single message flashing across the screen. "Stop digging." The blocked message still glowed in my mind as I met Patrick on the steps of the county courthouse the next morning. "Stop digging," it had said, like a threat tossed from a moving car. Patrick read it once on my phone and handed it back without a word. The January wind tugged at his coat and made his hair look whiter than it had in the cafe. "Good," he said. "If they're rattled, there's something to rattle." We pushed through the heavy glass doors into the smell of paper dust and old heating, an American archive of everything people try to hide and everything time refuses to forget. We signed the ledger at the records window and took our place at a long wooden table under a yellowed map of Dallas County. Patrick wrote on a request slip with quick, tidy strokes, RB Care Trust, Articles of Trust, Trustees, Amendments, Filings. The clerk, a woman with readers on a chain, typed slowly and shook her head. "No registered trust by that name in Dallas County," she said. Patrick's pen paused above the page. "Check variance," he said, spelling it again. She tried RB Care, R&B Care, RB Care. Nothing but a blinking cursor and the soft clack of keys, no trust, no filings, no legal backbone behind Michael's big-hearted story. Patrick didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth tightened. "Phantom," he murmured. "If it existed, it would live here or in a sister county." "Let's widen the net," he asked for real property indexes instead. We searched by Sophia's maiden name, Torres, then by her married name, then by a shell company Patrick suspected from habit, something bland enough to disappear in an inbox. The clerk slid over a stack of index cards and pointed us to a computer terminal older than my truck. Patrick moved like a man who'd spent his life hunting paper in rooms just like this. The shell gave itself away, not with its name, but with a pattern Sunvale Capital LLC form 2 weeks before Michael's first public claim about my allowance, listing a mail drop in Frisco as its address. Under Sunvale, a deed recorded the purchase of a coastal property not in Texas but a lakefront mansion in Travis County held as a vacation residence. The grantee on the deed of trust, Sunvale Capital LLC. The beneficiary, a private lender I'd never heard of. But the quitclaim filed 3 months later moved the beneficial interest to a name I knew now like a bruise, Sophia M. Torres. Patrick clicked through to the scanned deed. An image bloomed on the screen, a sprawling modern glass and stone house stepping down to the water, all decks and light and money. A dock with a boat lift, a negative edge pool, floor-to-ceiling windows the size of theater curtains. I leaned in until my forehead almost touched the glass. The price glowed in black type. More than a lifetime of my wages. The date aligned almost perfectly with the checks Maria had photographed. I felt my throat dry out as if the courthouse air had turned to sand. "So this is my $20K allowance?" I said, not loudly, but loud enough that the clerk at the far end of the room glanced up. The words didn't taste like defeat. They tasted like iron. Patrick's pen ticked across his pad. Trust's a ghost. Funds laundered through Sunvale. Beneficial ownership quietly reassigned to Sophia. The narrative to the world you're cared for, the ledger beneath your cover. He requested the wire affidavits attached to the transaction. The clerk fetched a box the color of old bone. Inside, clipped to the file, were redacted bank pages that still betrayed more than the black bars intended regular transfers from an entity labeled RB Care operating no trust suffix, no trustee into Sunvale's account, timed like a heartbeat. The amount sang a familiar number. 20,000, 20,000, 20,000. I could feel the heat rising into my face, a heat that had nothing to do with the feeble radiators. "No more guessing. No more," he said at a fancy table. This was paper with a spine. Patrick whispered the statutes under his breath like a prayer he'd said too many times. Fraudulent conveyance. Elder financial abuse, tax evasion if the allowance had been used to burnish public image while diverting funds. "We'll need the assessor's photos," he said. "We'll need HOA records, utilities, anything that puts them in that house, anything that shows benefit." He printed the deed and slid the copy toward me. My name wasn't on it anywhere. That hurt in a way I hadn't expected, like realizing your photo had been cut out of a family album. Still, the ache made room for something else, a clean, bright line from Michael's toast to Sophia's dock. If they had built a castle, they had used me as one of the stones, then painted over my face. When we stepped back into the winter light, the courthouse steps felt steeper than when we'd climbed them. People hurried past with folders tucked under their arms, each carrying their own bundle of truth and trouble. Patrick stopped beside me. "We move now," he said, quietly. "We preserve, we subpoena, and we don't tip our hand until we can put all of this in front of someone who can't look away." I nodded, gripping the folder so tightly the edges bit into my palm. At the bottom of the steps, my phone buzzed. A new text this time, not blocked: "Meet me at the Lakeside Club at 6. Come alone." It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the location told me exactly whose world I was walking into next. The text that summoned me to the Lakeside Club still pulsed in my pocket as I walked across the manicured drive. The building glowed like a cathedral of money, its columns draped in warm light, its glass doors held open by men in pressed uniforms. Inside, laughter mingled with the clinking of ice and crystal glasses, a soundtrack of entitlement. I had no membership card, no right to be there, but I carried something stronger. The truth. I found Michael and Sophia at the bar, exactly where I expected, framed by leather stools and a row of expensive bottles that gleamed under recessed lights. Michael looked like he belonged to the marble and brass, one hand resting casually on a tumbler of bourbon. Sophia perched beside him, her necklace catching the glow as though it had been designed for that very room. For a moment, they didn't notice me. When they did, Michael's smile froze. "Dad," he said, his voice pitched just high enough to register annoyance under a veneer of charm. "This isn't really the place." "It's exactly the place," I answered, stepping closer until the bar's polished wood reflected us side by side, father and son, truth and lie. I lowered my voice, but each word was heavy enough to carry. "Where is the money you told the world you give me?" Michael's smirk faltered. He set his glass down too quickly, liquid sloshing. "Not here. We'll discuss it privately." "No," I said. "We'll discuss it where you built the story, in public." Sophia touched his arm, trying to smooth the moment, but her eyes betrayed irritation. "Richard, please. You're making a scene. I'm exposing one I shot back." I leaned in close enough to smell Michael's cologne, sharp and expensive. "I've seen the Phantom Trust. The money didn't go to me. It went to you, Sophia." Her lips parted, and for the first time her composure cracked. She turned quickly toward Michael. "Michael, just tell him it was for appearances." The words escaped before she could cage them. The room seemed to still around us. Glasses hovered in mid-air, conversations stumbled. Michael's face went pale, then darkened with fury, his eyes darting toward the people nearby. He reached for Sophia's hand as though to silence her, but the damage was done. I slipped my phone from my pocket, the recording app glowing red. Every syllable was captured, undeniable. Michael noticed too late. His jaw clenched and his voice dropped to a growl. "You don't know what you're doing." I straightened, shoulders squaring against the weight of his anger. "I know exactly what I'm doing. You used me as your billboard, not your father." The words landed heavy, not just between us, but in the ears of every curious patron within reach. Sophia's face drained of color. Michael tried to gather himself, but the thin thread of control in his voice betrayed him. "Turn that off, Dad. You'll regret this." I met his gaze and pocketed the phone. "No, son, you will." The bartender cleared his throat, uncomfortable, while whispers bloomed among the club members. The image of Michael as the golden heir was crumbling right there under the same chandeliers that had once spotlighted his charm. I walked away from the bar with my pulse hammering but my steps steady. Outside, the night air was sharp, filled with the scent of pine and lake water. I pulled the phone from my pocket, the recording safe and glowing in my hand. For the first time, I held leverage strong enough to pierce Michael's armor. The screen lit again with a new message, this one from Patrick. "We need to move fast. Word is Michael's tightening his circle." The night after the confrontation at the club, I sat in my apartment with the recording still glowing on my phone. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of humiliation, but of decision. Patrick had warned me this would get uglier, but for the first time I felt I had a weapon. Still, a weapon in the dark is only as strong as the courage to use it. That was when I opened my laptop and began to write. The forum was one I had read for years but never dared to post on, a place where neighbors, retirees, and workers in Dallas shared everything from recipes to grievances. I titled my post "The Dependent Father." Then I poured myself onto the screen: the Christmas dinner lie, the phantom trust, the checks signed to Sophia. The nights of working 3 jobs while the world applauded Michael's generosity. I didn't write for sympathy. I wrote because silence had been their weapon and I was done carrying it for them. By morning, the post had spread further than I imagined. Replies stacked faster than I could read. Some wrote in anger, others in grief, but all of them carried the same thread of recognition. An older man said his son had moved into his house and pushed him into the garage. A widow explained how her daughter convinced her to sign over her pension only to be abandoned in a nursing home. One line stayed with me. They called me ungrateful when I asked for my own pension. I read it 3 times, feeling the sting of its familiarity. Hundreds of voices followed. My brother forged my signature. My children said my Social Security was for them. I worked 40 years and they treat me like an expense. Each confession was another brick in a wall I hadn't known existed. I had thought my shame was private, but here it was multiplied, reflected back by strangers who knew the weight of betrayal. The more I read, the more the weight on my chest shifted into something else: solidarity. One woman wrote, "Richard, your story is ours." The words cut through me, steadying me like a hand on my shoulder. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as if it were a window into every kitchen table, every cold apartment, every silent humiliation that people my age had endured. For the first time, I didn't feel like a solitary victim. I felt like part of a chorus. As the post spread, the messages turned sharper. A retired judge commented anonymously, reminding everyone that elder financial abuse was not just cruel but prosecutable. A younger man chimed in, "If this were my dad, I'd burn the lie down myself." The thread grew into something larger than a story. It was a reckoning. I scrolled through hundreds of replies until my eyes blurred, but my heart stayed fixed on the same thought: I wasn't alone. They had tried to convince me that my pride would keep me silent, that shame would bind me. But now I saw that pride could also be power, a refusal to let lies define me. I closed the laptop with hands steadier than they had been in weeks. The forum was only words, but words had weight, and now the weight was no longer mine alone. I glanced at the folder on the table full of deeds and statements and felt the resolve harden inside me. Just then the phone rang. It wasn't Patrick this time, nor a blocked number. It was a reporter from the Dallas Herald, her voice crisp with urgency. "Mr. Collins, I read your post. I think the city needs to hear this." The call from the reporter was still echoing in my head when Patrick suggested another lead. "There's someone who used to work inside," he told me. "If anyone knows how Michael built this house of cards, it's Alan Price, his former accountant." The name rang a bell. I remembered Alan as a nervous man, always adjusting his glasses, the kind who lived in spreadsheets. If he had left Michael's company, there had to be a reason. We met in a quiet diner off Interstate 30, the kind of place where the coffee was bottomless and the blinds stayed half shut. Alan sat in the corner booth hunched like he wanted to fold into himself. His eyes darted toward the window every time a car passed. When I slid into the seat across from him, he didn't shake my hand. He just whispered, "I can't be seen with you." I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "You don't have to go public, just tell me what you know." "You saw the numbers. You know the trust doesn't exist." He shook his head, sweat shining on his temples. "Michael has reach. People who cross him don't land on their feet. I've got a family to protect." His fork clattered against the plate as his hands trembled. He pushed the food away untouched. "I'm sorry, Richard. I can't." And just like that, he grabbed his coat and slipped out the door, leaving me with nothing but the check and a hollow ache. For days, I thought the trail had gone cold. Then one evening, a knock rattled my apartment door. When I opened it, Alan stood there, his face pale but his eyes hardened. He carried a folder so stuffed it looked ready to burst. "They ruined me too," he said before I could speak. "I won't let them ruin you." We sat at my table under the weak light of a single lamp. Alan pulled out printouts, emails, spreadsheets, tax records. He tapped one with a trembling finger. "Here, this was the setup. They created RB Care on paper, but for the IRS, they buried it under operating losses. The money moved through shell companies, then into Sophia's name. And anyone who asked questions got pushed out." I flipped through the pages, my pulse pounding. One email thread made my hands shake, Sophia herself instructing staff to redirect transfers. The subject line read "Dad's Allowance PR," and the body spelled it out in black and white label as "Support Trust, no questions." Optics matter more than paperwork. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in as the truth crystallized. This wasn't just betrayal. It was fraud, calculated and deliberate, written in their own words. Alan's voice cracked as he added, "I tried to raise concerns." Next thing I knew, I was pushed out with no severance. Then I found out Michael had invested client money into a side deal that tanked. My wife and I lost our savings. "He didn't just lie to you, Richard. He gutted me too." I set the papers down carefully as though they were explosives. In a way, they were. This was the kind of evidence that didn't just bruise reputations, it broke them. My throat tightened as I whispered, "This is it." Alan leaned back, his face lined with exhaustion but steadied by resolve. "If you go forward, I'll stand with you. He thinks he can bury the truth, but paper doesn't lie, and this paper could bury him." I gathered the stack into the folder, my fingers gripping it like a lifeline. The evidence was no longer whispers or suspicion, it was undeniable, their signatures betraying them more loudly than any witness could. Just as I slid the folder into my drawer, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a threat. It was the Dallas Herald reporter. The message was short, urgent. "We're running the story Sunday. Be ready." The folder Alan had delivered sat heavy in my hands as Patrick and I walked up the courthouse steps. The Dallas County seal glinted in the morning sun, the kind of symbol meant to remind men that truth still had guardians. My chest tightened, but not with fear. This was the day silence ended. Patrick pushed open the tall glass doors, and together we crossed into the marble hall that smelled of paper polish and old justice. Filing the petition felt almost unreal. Patrick slid the stack of documents across the counter to the clerk, who stamped them, with a sound that cracked like a gavel. Elder financial abuse, fraudulent trust, misappropriation of assets. The charges were no longer whispers in the dark corners of my apartment. They were ink on official pages, my name as plaintiff Michael and Sophia listed in black and white as defendants. I signed at the bottom with a hand that trembled but didn't falter. By afternoon, the storm began. Michael's legal team, polished men in expensive suits, moved quickly. Patrick received an email marked confidential. Inside was a thinly veiled threat: withdraw or be destroyed in court. The following day, a letter arrived at my apartment with no return address. The paper was thick, the font cold, the message plain. If you continue this, your reputation will not survive. I read it once, then again, then tore it in half. For years I had been silenced by shame, but this time shame was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to them. I called Patrick and told him exactly what I thought. They think fear will silence me. They're wrong. The words steadied me sharper than any blade. The days that followed blurred into filings, affidavits, and strategy sessions in Patrick's office. We spread the evidence across his oak table: Maria's photo of the check, Alan's emails, the phantom trust deeds, the recording from the club. Each piece was a brick, and together they built a wall too strong for denial. Patrick's eyes gleamed with resolve. They can hire the biggest names in Dallas, he said, but facts don't care about reputations. News of the lawsuit leaked faster than we expected. A local station ran a headline: Dallas developer accused of defrauding his own father. My phone lit up with calls I didn't answer, some sympathetic, some furious. Neighbors whispered when I passed, their eyes widening at the thought that a man as polished as Michael might be dragged into the mud of his own making. Michael's response came swift and arrogant. He held a press conference outside his office, Sophia at his side, their lawyer, speaking of unfounded claims, and a father sadly confused by age watching it on television. I felt the sting, but also the strength of knowing I had the documents they couldn't bury. They were betting on public doubt. I was betting on the truth. At night, alone in my apartment, I spread the papers across the table and studied them like maps. Each page was a step closer to reclaiming not just my dignity, but the years they had stolen. My anger no longer burned wild. It was honed, deliberate. Revenge was no longer a wish whispered in shame. It was a case number in the Dallas County docket. The court date was set. Patrick told me it would be weeks before we stood before a judge, but every day until then would be a battle. I looked out the window at the city lights flickering against the dark and felt the weight of what was coming. For the first time, it wasn't just Michael and Sophia I was fighting. It was the idea that men like them could twist family into currency and expect to walk away clean. As I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into shadow, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a threat. It was a voicemail from the Dallas Herald reporter. Her voice was urgent, electric. Mr. Collins, the community wants to hear you speak. There's a rally forming downtown. Will you stand before them? A year passed, but the memory of that courthouse stamp and the threats that followed never faded. Each day had been a battle: hearings, filings, statements, counterstatements, but slowly the tide shifted. Evidence piled higher than Michael's charm could reach, and Sophia's polished smiles cracked under the weight of her own words. When December came again, I knew exactly how I wanted the curtain to fall. I sent out invitations to a Christmas gathering, but this time it was not in Michael's marble dining room. It was mine, and the guest list included not just family, but the very reporters who had followed every step of the case. The hall I rented wasn't as grand as Michael's country club, but it didn't need to be. Garlands hung along the walls, a tree glowed with warm lights, and the tables were filled with neighbors, friends, and faces I had once thought of as strangers. They were here because they had read my words, heard my voice, and recognized themselves in my fight. When Michael and Sophia arrived, their entry was not greeted by applause, but by silence. The kind that strips a person of their stage. Cameras tilted toward them, microphones angled like arrows. I stood at the head of the room, my folder resting on the podium. My hands didn't shake this time. I began slowly reminding everyone of the story that had started it all: the Christmas toast, the phantom trust, the checks to Sophia's name. Then I opened the folder. The first page projected onto the screen behind me: the deed for the lakefront mansion, the one they had hidden under Sunvale Capital. Murmurs rippled through the room. The second page: Sophia's email instructing staff to label lies as support trust. And finally, the recording from the club, Sophia's own words spilling into the microphone: "Michael, just tell him it was for appearances." Michael shifted in his chair, jaw-tight eyes darting toward the exits as though escape could undo the truth. Sophia sat frozen, her smile stretched thin, her diamond necklace suddenly gaudy under the bright lights of exposure. I looked directly at them, then at the room full of witnesses, and spoke the words I had carried like a blade for a year. This year the gift is truth, and it's yours to choke on. The silence broke not with applause, but with the clicking of cameras and the steady voices of reporters calling questions. "Did you defraud your father? Mrs. Torres, did you sign these checks?" Every word I had spoken was now theirs to answer, not mine. The power that had once been used to humiliate me was stripped from their hands and laid bare before the world. I stood straighter than I had in years, my head high, my voice calm. For too long I had been made into a prop in someone else's performance, a father paraded as a symbol of generosity that never existed. Tonight I ended that play. The lies were no longer my burden. They were theirs to bear under the bright lights and the unforgiving eyes of a community that had seen enough. As the evening drew on, I let myself breathe. I watched Michael and Sophia leave through the side door, reporters at their heels, their carefully built image crumbling like paper left in the rain. Around me, neighbors clasped my hand. Strangers embraced me, and a woman whispered, "You gave us courage." Her words carried more weight than any verdict. I looked toward the Christmas tree, its lights steady, its ornaments gleaming. For the first time in years, I felt the season not as a hollow stage, but as something real, honest mine. Betrayal had carved deep wounds, but truth had filled them with something stronger than pride, dignity. And as I left the podium, I thought of every father, mother, and elder who had been told they were ungrateful for wanting their own labor's fruits. My story was finished, but the questions it raised would echo longer. What do we owe family, and what does family owe us? Those answers, I knew, would spark more reckoning than even my revenge had. When I began this story, I carried only shame and silence. Tonight, as it closes, I carry something far heavier and far more freeing: the truth. The lies that were told in my name are no longer mine to bear. They belong to the ones who built them, and they will live with their collapse. To those of you who have watched, who have seen your own struggles reflected in mine, I say this: you are not alone. Betrayal within a family cuts the deepest, but it does not have to be the final word. Dignity is not a gift given by children or spouses. It is ours, earned across a lifetime, and no one has the right to steal it. This fight was never just about $20,000, a mansion, or even a forged trust. It was about justice, about refusing to be erased, about showing that the truth can stand taller than any lie. And now that truth has been spoken, witnessed, and recorded, it can never be taken back. If my story has struck you, if it has reminded you of the value of your own voice, then stay with me. Subscribe to hear the stories that others want to keep in the dark. Leave your thoughts below, because your voice matters as much as mine. And now I leave you with this question, one that lingers long after the lights dim. When blood betrays you, does loyalty still bind, or does justice finally set you free?